So we'll start with, can you just tell me a little bit about the background of the family and all that, and how you came to Waterford and your family, all that?
Well, as I said, the whole thing was my father was working for a while in Bavaria after the war, when Mr. Batchik and there was another gentleman that at the time came over, and he interviewed people that worked in the glass industry it would have been in Swiesel and Regensburg, and they kind of offered them, as I said, to come to Ireland. They wanted to make a nice package out of it to make sure that they would come. And people were it was something new. They were worried about the language problem, but as anybody would say, eventually that wasn't, because there were so many Germans, they knew they weren't going to be on their own, and that they would eventually, fall in, kind of. And my father and my mother, they were all delighted actually to come over to start a new life. For them it was, because my mother spent 10 years nearly on her own and trying to rear the kids, and it was lovely to come over to a small place like Ireland. And there was a lot of nice things, even though times were poor here, and it was a bit of a shock first when they came and not having the language and having to try and find food. And my father, it was amazing that at the time Waterford had a lot of ships coming in from abroad, and a lot of German ships and Polish ships and all of that, and they used to always go down to meet the sailors and the engineers, because they always gave them some German food, and it was all very, sort of very exciting. I mean, sometimes my father'd come home after being down there, and he'd bring these people home, and I used to have to make coffee for them and do up something nice. And my mother used to be always giving out, saying, "Why are you bringing all these people?" But you can imagine there was nothing here in the line of food except whatever was going, bacon and, the usual kind of food. And it took them quite a while. And of course the women kind of found it very difficult as well. They used to try and go shopping together, and they used to have paper bags with little bits of sugar and flour and different things in. And Hughes's store was in the centre of the city. Hughes's, they were quite a big draper's store, and they used to have an account there, and they were able to go in and buy everything they needed. And people got used to them and that.
Would any particular stores cater for their food needs, like Chapman's right now?
Chapman's was the only place that you might have got maybe a little bit of salami or maybe some brown bread. It took quite a long time. And when my father used to always go home every year on holidays, and the only thing he used to always look forward to is that he'd bring home some salami and sausages and anything that not cheese was not the problem. It was the different types of meat, the cold meats and the sausages and all of that sort of thing that you couldn't get here, and
did that ever change? I mean,
it changed.
The
Brenners then were there. They used to go in occasionally to get pork, because Brenner's opened. They used to do their own pork, and they used to make their own sausages, and my mother did buy bits and pieces from there. And I must say, he was a lovely man. He used to do some labour case, which they loved very much. And as I said, it got gradually better as time went on, but it took a few years. And the only thing that changed so much now in comparison, you have Little and Aldi's, and I'm always saying all the German beers that my father used to go down, and he used to beg the lads on the ship to give. He was willing to pay for it, because they missed that sort of thing quite a bit. And every Friday they used to take it in turns, because they found it very lonely first, and very difficult. So they used to have card nights on a Friday night, and they were in different houses. Each of them had to have a card night every Friday somewhere else. And they kind of, they did serve. The women then used to have their coffee at lunchtime. They used to all meet together with their babies and children, and they used to
So they
kind
had
of...
their own little social.
Their little social life, it became better in the end afterwards, but for quite a few years until they got the language and they kind of got used to the place, because Ireland was a very different place to what it is now. I remember the one thing that they used to find so funny, that they used to get people, everybody used to talk about the Germans out on the German road, because they used to say, you want to go out there in the morning, they have all their beds hanging out the window. And it was a big thing. You'll see it in Austria when you're on holidays, or Germany. We had the Downs at the time, which wasn't a thing that was here. I mean, people used blankets and that sort of thing. In Germany, they had all their own feather beds, which we would call Downs now, and pillowcases. And they had this special kind of a sort of a thing to beat the mattress and get all the dust out of it. And they used to leave all their linen, their bed linen, out on the window to air. And of course the Irish thought they were absolutely stone raving mad, you know. And that was a big thing. Like, there was a lot of little things that they used to do, I suppose, that they found hard to, you know, to get rid of and that. Yeah. But
and you spoke German?
We spoke German, and I always remember when I started school, I was terrified, because when the first time we'd go to school and they were all saying their prayers, and I was trying to show that I kind of knew how to do it, and I was kind of trying to copy the girls and put my mouth going up and down. I was, you know, because I thought the nun, I remember we had Mother Gustin and at the time Miss Doolin, and they were very, very nice. But for me, it was a kind of a bit of an ordeal until I got the hang of the language. But then we grew up with both, and this is why I was happy that I kept up some of the language, and when I go on holidays, at least I can get by. And the reason being, it was amazing. It didn't happen in my father's time, but when we went into the taxi business and into the corporate business ourselves, we ended up doing work for Waterford Crystal, and it was amazing that we ended up actually picking up people who owned their factories in Regensburg and Blattling, all the areas where my father and his brothers all worked. And when I was able to talk to them, they couldn't believe it, because they always said to me, you couldn't be not from Bavaria, you have such a Bavarian slang. And I suppose because we always spoke at home in the house, you didn't lose that end of it, you know, and that. But you know, that's...
And then how did you manage in school? Like, did you learn Irish as well?
I learned everything right from the start, because you must remember, I started school right from the scratch, from 4, you know, at the age of 4. So, like, you had to learn everything, probably just like the normal kids. It was easier to learn it because you learned how to do your alphabet, and you learned how to read and write. So it didn't seem to matter so much, you know.
And would you got treated any differently by any of your children?
No, definitely not. We all got on great, you know. That it's amazing. And then when, like, we had more than, as the houses were being built, you made more friends once they started coming into John's Park was built first, and I must say we had some lovely neighbours there, and we had some really nice times.
But would your friends when you were small, would they be mostly people from the John Road, or would they be people from St. John's Park, or where would it be?
We just made friends with people from John's Park that were, there was a lot of people. There was the Fagan family, they came from Dublin, and she was Galway. There was a lot of the Maycocks, they were Dublin. And there was a lot of people, there was Waterford people that came, but there was also a lot of people that weren't from Waterford.
So there was a good mix.
So there was a good mix, and we all everybody, the funny thing about it was everybody got on well, and my mother in particular, because my mother had a great way about her, and she was very sociable, and she knitted and she crocheted, and she used to help women, because she was very, very good at painting. And I remember she used to go down to people's houses and she used to help them she had a kind of a rubber roller which she used to do when, and she'd show them how to, it wasn't wallpaper, it was actually paint. But she had this special roller that she brought from Germany, and she used to mix her own colours, and she used to show them how to. Everybody thought it was real wallpaper, but it was actually done with paint and that. And she did an awful lot for people. She was very, very, very well liked. Even when the next door neighbour, the two next door neighbours, the kids always called her Granny. You know, she was always known as to them.
Yeah.
Because she was very maternal, and the kids, that's what they always called her. And even when she died, like, they had a special wreath for her, and they were lovely. And the neighbours were fantastic there, because, you know, they used to bake, and she used to bake, and they used to hand each other around 11 o'clock a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, and you'd have a piece of this and that. So people did mingle, and they were very fond of the Irish, and I think they got on well themselves, most
and
people.
to go back a little bit further, I mean,
Yeah.
your mum and dad came from Germany. That was after the war.
Yes.
Was your dad in the army?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
He was away for nearly 10 years.
Go away.
Yeah. He was sent home once or twice because he was dying. He had a burst appendix, and they had to send him home, and he wasn't well one time. But the rest of the time, as I said, my sisters, I'll always remember when my mother said to me that when she lived in Bavaria, that the kids were out, the two girls were out in the garden one day, and they were playing, and the next thing they saw this man coming up in a uniform, and they ran in and they said, "Mum, there's a stranger coming up the street," and it was actually their father. They didn't recognise him, you know. And that there was you know, a lot of things. I'd say women had a tough time, you know.
And did he ever talk about his war?
He didn't like talking about it. He used to always go down to the pub, which was in John's Park. It was called the Candy Store, and he loved going down there every night for a drink, and he used to mingle with the lads. But anytime he was ever you know, asked about the war, he used to say, "Look, I don't want to talk about it," because there were hard times. And as he often said, like, you know, you were disliked sometimes for being a German. There was a lot of people who would have a dislike to you because they automatically thought that you know, you were to blame for it, you know. And he always just didn't want to make too much of it. He'd kind of say, "We'll talk about something else," you know, because as I said, you wanted to be liked where you lived, and even though you might have had one or two enemies, always, even though for no reason, it would be just that you were German at the time. And I often say, sometimes people found that they were afraid, do you know, when they'd see the Germans coming out, the kids first when they were there, because they were associated with the war, and they must have spoken about it at home. So everybody thought, gee, you know, they were frightened more or less. And we thought that was very funny, because my husband said he was working for the dairy, helping the McGraths out to deliver milk. And we used to be terrified going up to your door. We used to try and run up, and we'd fly out again. Don't ask me, he said, what we're afraid of. We thought the Germans were an awful crowd.
But the enemy.
Yeah, the enemy and that, you know. So I suppose they were things.
I suppose we were very influenced by the British, I suppose.
Yes, yeah.
And what about, like, you know, that community? Because, I mean, like, it was obviously a very important group from the point of view of helping to start the glass factory.
Oh, yeah.
So you had like Italians and
we had mainly Italians, and we had Mr. Havel would have been Czech. There would have been maybe 2 lots of Czech people, but the rest would have been more Italian and German. And we had the odd person like Kurt Berger, who was the mold maker. He would have been from behind the Iron Curtain. And Joseph Kretzen, he wasn't a real German. He came, I think he worked in Germany, but he would have had to come in during that time.
He's from Romania.
He was, as far as I know, Joe was Romanian. He was an awful man. We used to be terrified of him because he was an awful, he'd be, you know, he was just a funny character, but you know the way he'd make a run at you. We used to absolutely, I'd hide for a day if I thought he was coming up to the house. And we grew up with, I mean, kids would have grown. They never had a family. They actually adopted a boy and a girl, which is David and Christina. And we were great friends with them. And they'd always, at Christmas time, come up to the house. Because my mother, I would have been brought up with a different kind of cuisine as the fella, not, you know, my mother used to make dumplings, and she used to do an awful lot of German cooking. Very much, she might do an odd little bit that the Irish would eat, but it was always very, very different. And because Joe was married to an Irish person, he used to, at Christmas time, he used to love coming up with the two of them, and my mother would give them a piece of cake, German cake and all of this, and they used to love it, and we had some lovely times together, you know. And I'm sure David will tell you, we were it was very, very easy, and everybody loved to I mean, my father, he made a lot of friends, and you always found that if people like Watty Walsh was a person that lived down a little bit away from us, and he used to do a lot of fishing, and when he'd catch an eel, they'd normally throw in an eel, they wouldn't eat it, but they'd always say, go up to the Gostel family, and she'll love that. And he used to bring them up, and then she would say, when I'm making it, you can come up and have a piece, I'd like you to taste it, because they would never had anything like that. And my mother used to have a special way of taking the skin down and cooking it, and he, to this day, he'd often stop and he'd say, God, remember the good old days, you know. He said, your mother was fantastic, and she used to cook some really good things, and everybody used to bring things to her, because she was able to do anything. I mean, she used to have a kid goat. She used to even kill her own hens, and she had a fabulous vegetable garden. You know, not that there was much. I mean, in John's Park there was only small the houses, but we still had a little bit of a back. And in those days, everybody, especially the women, they were used to growing their own vegetables and you know, making certain things at Christmas like that you wouldn't have any other time, and biscuits, and you know, they were constantly, see, there was no television, and women devoted their time to baking and cooking, and we were very much brought up with a completely different diet. And I always remember my mother used to make, in those days, garlic bread was like, she would put some toast under the grill and toast it, and then she'd get the garlic and she'd rub the garlic into the hot bread, and then she'd butter it first. And when I'd go to school, even though I'd clean my teeth so well, they used to say to me, oh, you were eating that horrible stuff again, you know, the garlic. It was very hard to get it from your breath and that. And I used to say to my mother, don't ask me to eat that again, because they're giving me an awful tough time in school, I said, telling me that I smell from that horrible stuff. You know, when you're young, you'd be very conscious of it and that, you know, and that.
And did you keep any of that, did you learn any of that stuff from your mother?
Oh, I did. I still, do you know, last year was the first time that I kept up the tradition, because see, the problem was I was the only girl left here. So if anybody, when we had a wedding or we had anything, my relations would come over, and they would always stay with me, because my brothers they didn't bother. So I took my mother's place once they came. And you know, say Christmas time, Christmas Eve was a very special time. Christmas Eve was what we would call our big Christmas. It was like Christkindle. Christkindle came at 6 o'clock, around 6, on Christmas Eve night. And for the first time, like my mother we never saw a Christmas tree when we were young, or ever knew what we were getting. And for weeks she would bake special biscuits, and she would do special things with fish, and we used to have a lot of things that she would do for the couple of weeks beforehand. And then every night she'd go in and she'd do up this room. And when Christmas Eve came, we had a beautiful Christmas meal around 6. When Christkindle came, she'd ring a bell and we'd all arrive in and she'd open up this room, and it was so nice. We saw this Christmas tree, and at the time we didn't have electric Christmas lights. We had real candles, and my mother used to have them lighting, and she'd have all our presents underneath, and it was just fantastic. We used to just live for it, and we always had roast pork done with caraway seed, and we had knödels, and we had sauerkraut with German sausages, and we had, oh my God, cucumber salad and anything. She used to always have some really nice food. She used to spend a lot of time. So kind of then on Christmas Day then, she would come up to me, or vice versa. We'd have what they'd have in Ireland, we'd have a turkey as well, so that we celebrated both. You know, we kind of felt it was the thing to do. But, you know, it was very important to us as a family. And I found it hard when my kids were teenagers, and I'd say to them, I don't mind you going out, I don't mind what you do, but I want you here at 7 o'clock. 7:30 is deadline. I said, if not, I said, there's going to be war, because it was so special for us. And sometimes they'd bring back some friends, because, you know, they were used to going off, and to them it wasn't their celebration. Christmas Day was their big time, and they always came home, and we always had a lovely Christmas, and I kept that tradition up, you know, I always did. And everybody, I had all my family here. I had my in-laws sometimes. I'm sure I had at least 15 people every Christmas Eve, and we'd have a big fire lighting outside, like a big bonfire and that, and you'd have the room beautifully done, and you'd always have really nice food, and you'd be cooking from early morning till they'd come in at the last minute, you know, and the same then Christmas Day, and it was a wonderful time, and it was a very special celebration. It wasn't anywhere else except in most of the German homes that they would celebrate that. And I tried to keep that tradition up. Now, I don't know whether my children will ever, because, you know, I find, I suppose my daughter is the only one, she's the only girl, and it's usually the girls that would do that part of it. But she's not too interested. She says, too much like hard work, Mum. You know, so when I'm gone, whether any of them, now the only person that would maybe, because he's around me more and he sees things, and they're very interested in cooking themselves, the boys, is my youngest son, because he lives down below from us here, and he's up and down and he sees what's going on, and he has a great interest, even in foreign food. He's always making things. He's a real health person about food. He doesn't just make food for the sake of cooking. He always likes to, you know, come up with something that's healthy, and he'll make things that are a little bit different and very unusual, even though he might have to go to a lot of trouble making them. But other than that, as I said,
just to go back tiny bit, do you know that they received enough recognition for what they did in the company? Because
they didn't. See, what I found very sad, you know, because I had quite a lot to do with driving people, and I saw what went on, and how my father now, I mean, he was so, Waterford Crystal was like God, you know, he spoke about him. You know, he spoke about it. It was so important to him. And he was so interested in what he was doing. And he used to, as I said, every morning he got up at 5:15, didn't matter what, and he'd have his cup of tea and his piece of toast, and he'd head off for work. And he was always there to prepare the glass. Now, what he meant by preparing, because I used to say to him, Dad, what are you talking about, you know, preparing the glass? He used to go in, because there'd be bubbles and there might be small stones and all of that, and he had a special way of cleaning that glass, and he used to get it all ready so that when the lads would come in, they were able to use the glass straight away. And also their glass, they had a higher percentage of glass that they were able to make. They were besides anybody else, because everything was already prepared. And he was so good about anything he thought. He would have put in his absolute utmost that whoever he trained, you know, that they would really know. He never, never spoke. His work was really his big thing in life, you know. He never switched off from it. He used to...
And you were saying that from driving people around, you knew what was going on.
Oh yeah. I mean, we found that out afterwards. That was that was the sad part, because my father never realised. He had just died when things started to get bad. Remember when the economy and Waterford Crystal at the time the American economy, I think, because they dealt with the Americans only for so many years, they were very big in America for years, and that, but he didn't live to find out afterwards. And when they started to do tours, which at that time, when my father was alive and when they were working and doing whatever they were doing, they didn't have tours. They started all that after my father died, because I think they realised that they had to turn things around and everything had to make money for them. And of course, they didn't do it when they had big money and when they had plentiful. They should have diversified then into other things, which they started doing then. But that's how it was afterwards then when they start outsourcing to Germany and different countries. And that I ended up driving people from the area, from Sweezel, Blattling, Regensburg, and I kind of nearly knew what they were talking about, because you'd hear so much of it at home, and I was the only one, because I just happened to be just at the age where when you're at home you hear more that what's going on, and I kind of had a great interest myself, because I actually went with Jim afterwards, and we flew into Munich, and we got the train that took us the whole way up to where my father went and where he worked. And his father, not his father, but his brothers all worked at Shut Crystal, in Regensburg and Blattling. They all did glass. They seemed to have all at that time. It was a huge industry there, more so than anywhere else.
But do you think that maybe...
But I thought it was sad myself. He didn't. And I'm glad he wasn't alive, because I think they kind of forgot that these men did so much by bringing... But they really did. They trained people, and they had a lot, they put a lot of effort into that, and everything had to be done right. They didn't accept anything that was slapdash or anything, and they put a lot of work into it. But it wasn't, when the tours were actually, I didn't realise, it was shortly afterwards that, when I'd say to people about the tours, that recognition wasn't given, that they'd put so much work and effort, that they actually came to Ireland when I'm so sorry, can I? Sorry about that. Oh God, sorry.
But just the question was
about the recognition.
Yeah, but do you think that it was deliberately left out?
It's very, very hard to know. I'd hate to say that it was, or else it was just that, they wanted to just maintain the fact that the Irish people themselves, that it just happened to be there, because they did have a factory. We always knew that there was a factory, a glass factory, a glass industry. But seemingly during the Civil War, they told us it had died out and there wasn't any more, there wasn't anybody around that actually, craftsmen, they weren't there. So this is why when I think Mr. Batchek at the time and Dr. Winkleman, and when they thought that this would be a good thing to open again, because there was a crystal here, and they just needed people, and the people that they knew exactly where to look, because
what I'm saying is it probably would look better in America.
Oh, it would, yeah.
To talk about the Irish.
Yes, sure it would have.
As opposed to talk about the Germans.
Yes. They should have just put in some little thing maybe to make it known that it was
revived.
It was revived. That was so important, and I think they should have just given them a little bit more recognition, because they were so dedicated to what they were doing. You know, it wasn't so much that it was just a job. You know, the people that they brought over were so interested in their work, and my father, they were so dedicated and they wanted to do well. And I mean, when you think about it, there was about 9 people in the first place in Kilcone where they opened up that small, it was like a hut at the time. From there, when they had people trained, they then went to Johnstown. And it was Johnstown that it actually went really well. They ended up with 3,000 people there. And that should have been a great recognition for the Germans and the Italians, and that came over and put so much effort into it, you know, that they could have given them a little bit more recognition for it. And I can't say that there was anything wrong, but I thought it was sad more than anything else, because I'm sure that the likes of my father would have been delighted that they would have got some little mention. And you'll probably find that out from David Kretzen as well, because we often spoke about it with David, to say that, you know, God, there's nothing much. And this is what made David, I think, do what he did. He opened up a complete, he spent, I'm sure, the last couple of years putting things together and finding things belong to his father, because he probably thought, like I did, that they were fantastic craftspeople. And I'm sure David would have some nice pieces of glass that his father would have done, and he would have probably felt a little bit like I did, that I think they should have given them, when they were doing the tour, a little bit more recognition. But maybe, as you say, that they were so big in America at the time, and the Irish were so liked and loved by the Americans, that maybe they felt they didn't want to give them too much recognition.
Muddy the water.
Yes. Maybe that's one of the reasons. And I felt it for my father, and I felt it for the likes of Joe and some of the people that are still here and are living here. And I'm sure they're going to end up dying here. You know, they didn't ever ask to go. I mean, my father would have never wanted to go back to Germany. He loved it here. And, you know, they had some nice friends, and we grew up, and just like, I mean, I would never say, I mean, I love Germany, and I love going back on holidays, and I love meeting my mother's family. There's very few left still, but I mean, you do like to feel, you don't want to forget your past. Yes. And I must say, I often say it to the kids now. Eric, my youngest son now, he would have taken his son over to where I was born, and he's shown him, and, you know, places, and shown him exactly where his great grandfather, isn't it, was worked in that. So he has a great interest in it.
Where were you born?
In Swiesel.
Swiesel.
Yeah.
And that's part of Bavaria?
That's part of Bavaria. I mean, that part, Swiesel, Regensburg, Blattling, is all part. I mean, you travel along that area, and all the factories you're passing are all the ones that Waterford Crystal would have been dealing with, outsourcing, you know, to at the time. Okay. And I was amazed. They were actually amazed themselves. It was just so funny to meet somebody from where you came, and to be able to tell them that your father came here and so many years ago, and that they were fascinated.
What is Bavaria? I mean, I know it's very mountainous. And green.
It's a very agricultural side of Germany, I suppose.
It's also very conservative, isn't it?
Yeah, they're a lot more friendly. They're known as the country people more. I find the Bavarian people, they have a certain sort of more of a countryish way about them, you know. They're of course the landscape, they're very outdoor, and they love shooting, and they do a lot of fishing, and the area, the scenery there is magnificent. You know, you're coming from a completely wooded. They love, my mother used to, that's the one thing my mother and father missed an awful lot when they came here. They used to have the special mushrooms that they used to grow in Bavaria, in the woods, and they kind of missed that part of it as well. I'd be afraid now. I know they did say that there was a small place in Portlaw that they were able to get a kind of an egg mushroom, but you had to be very careful because mushrooms are so dangerous. And if you don't know much about them.
Did your dad fish?
No. My father didn't do anything. His job was his whole life. And when he was finished, he'd have his meal and he'd get washed and dressed and he might go down and have a drink with some of the friends. It was only a stone throw away from where he lived. And that was his whole, and he loved having his get-together with cards and a drink, and at Christmas time they'd have little celebrations amongst themselves.
And would they play German card games?
Oh, they would, yeah. Zwicken, they used to call it. And that, I think I've forgotten. I used to love playing.
How do you play this?
It's a bit like poker, you know.
Okay.
But I haven't played now for so many years. I used to love it, and I mean they played for money. Oh, it is a gamble. They used to all put in a certain amount of money, and then they'd have their beers. I used to have to go down to Garvey's every Friday, and I'd bring up beers for my father and for different people. You know, they'd have you going down.
Maybe all lager?
Lager, oh yeah, all lager mainly. They used to love Carlsberg. They used to say Carlsberg was the nearest beer to what they were used to in Germany, you know, and that. But they drink, I'm sure I'm sure a lot of them liked the Guinness as well, you know, but they love lager. Yeah.
And just before we finish, just about your own childhood in the area.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about that, like going to school and how did you get on?
Well, we see, as I said, I was probably as I got older, you know, I mean, we all had lovely friends and we all got on great. We used to go to each other's houses and we used to go to, in those days, we used to get the train out to Tremor and we used to do some lovely things. We had a really nice childhood. We didn't have money or anything, but we used to do lovely things. We used to go out for tadpoles out the country. We used to take out our little buckets and head off, and Mother's Day, we used to go out to the back of Kilcone where the old airport road is, and we used to, there was a tree there and there was a little graveyard, and there was a little old lady used to live there by the name of Nolan, and we used to go out there and we used to steal she had these big lilac trees, and the German Mother's Day was always around the first week in May. And we used to go out there and we used to have big bunches of lilac to bring home for Mother's Day and that. And we had we had a lovely childhood amongst all of us, because there's quite a lot of kids on that road. When Johns Park was built, there was quite a lot of young families, and we all grew up together and we went to school and you know, and as I said, they've all a lot of them have kind of gone. They're not living around anymore. We don't see that many people. Occasionally you might meet an odd person, but you kind of lose track. Some of them went to Spain, some of them went to England. You might meet one or two people that you would have gone to school with, but they were lovely days. And did
you go to the Ursula?
I went to the St. Anne's first. Okay. That was the St. Anne's was the little private school for the first, until I found that a lot of the kids on the street where we lived went to the Ursula, which was next door, and I ended up kind of wanting it eventually. And then I found my father, I don't know whether I should say this, but my father was very tight about money, and and that was a fee that we used to have to pay.
So it suited him to push you to the Ursula?
No, it didn't suit him. He didn't like the idea of having to pay for it, see. And I didn't realise that, or maybe my mother didn't, but I used to sort of say, listen, Mum, I'm not going to be getting up begging Dad for this money all the time. And it's quite embarrassing, I used to say to him, to have to keep getting up at 5:15 in the morning to say, Dad, you have to give me, because the nuns have asked me for it. And in the end, I got around my mother that she would change me over to the Ursula. And I left school at a very early age. I wasn't a bit interested in school. I think it was the fact that my father was so tight about money, and that it was such a big ordeal to get books and to get things, because his attitude was, as a girl, you don't need to be educated. You're going to get married.
Yes.
So he kind of felt it was such a waste. And every time I needed a book, I mean, they laugh at it now because I often say it about my grandchildren. I'm saying how much you put into them, make sure that they're getting extra tuition to help them out. You're doing everything in your power. And it was quite the opposite for me. So without my parents knowing, when I was 13, I remember going home from school and going into town and looking for a job. And one of the reasons I wanted to get out was because I found it very difficult. I had no interest in studying and I knew I wasn't going to get anywhere. But I had a very much a liking for hairdressing, and I ended up at 13 getting myself into one of the... it was a howl because she often says to me when I went in to look for a job, she said, "You're very young." And I said, "Well, I don't want to do anything else on the hairdressing, but if you could give me a job until you have a free place, I'd be willing to work for nothing, And she kind of took me on in Seamus's, and then I ended up in Cesar's for 13 years. And
so who was Seamus? What was that?
Seamus is on the Quay. That was the first place that Mrs. Furlong actually was the name of, but Seamus was the man that she was married to. He was very famous as a hairdresser. He came from New Ross, and I asked her, would she not let me do the reception, and I'd work for nothing until she had a place, because I had to come home to say to my mother and my father, "Listen, I have a job. I want to do this now." And that is what then got me out of school. And I never even did my intercert. I ended up training. And when I was there for about 2 years, I ended up going to Cesar's. And I worked there then for 13 years before we opened up. And we went into a partnership with 2 other people and a Swedish lady at the time. But that was one of the reasons. Times where,
So you ended up working for yourself eventually?
Eventually then, yeah.
And then, what was Waterford like at that stage when you were 13?
13, there wasn't much going on, to be honest with you, but we did have, the St. John's social, and this is how we used to try and get out maybe. That was the only thing, the Olympia, and they used to run a social for the younger girls and boys at the time, and we used to try and get down to that. And there wasn't much really. We used to come home and we used to have all sorts of games that we used to do, outdoor games, and that's all we ever did. And we went out the country to do certain things. We picked blackberries, we went out for tadpoles, there was always something, because there was nothing else, and we didn't have the money to do anything else. Our parents didn't have it.
And would you go back to Germany once a year? Or anything?
No, I used to go back more often when the kids were younger. I used to take them with us and that.
No, but when your parents were alive?
No, we didn't go for, oh God, I think my father brought me back. I think it was the first time I ever saw my relations or met anybody belonged to my family was when I was about 13. That was the first time my father brought us back. My brother, one of my brothers and myself, he brought us over to meet his brother, and we stayed with him. And then we went to Munich and met his sister, and we met a lot of the family for the first time. And then afterwards, when I got married, then we went a couple of times to visit different people, and that, so it was nice.
You know your father and all the other people that were over from Germany, what was their attitude to the Irish?
How do you mean?
What did they think of the Irish?
They were very fond of the Irish because they were very easygoing. They were fascinated because they were so easygoing. Everybody was very friendly, and nobody ever insulted them or anything. It was just that they enjoyed their work, and they as their language got a bit better and they were able to communicate a little bit better, they decided that they were able to mix with people more, and that, and they were very fond of the Irish. They always thought they were very, very easygoing and very nice, and they never had any problems. And I think they felt the same when they were in work. They were so dedicated. All they wanted to do, they didn't want to do anything, only do their work and get on as well as they could. And when they come home, then have their little rest, and then at weekends, then they'd do whatever had to be done.
And were all those people, were they all Catholic?
All Catholics, yeah.
Oh, was it?
Even though they weren't great practicing Catholics as such, my mother would have been very much. My mother and there was a couple of the German people, but they would have been Catholics, but not very good for going to mass and that. But they would have been religious in their own way. My mother now would have been a great church goer, and she would have, as I said, she was very, very good with people, and she was always trying to help, and she wouldn't miss a rosary, or she wouldn't miss anything. She was really out on her own in that way, you know. I found she was very and people still remember her for helping people out if their marriage was broke up. She'd go and visit, and she'd ask to help them out and do little things for them, you know, and that. But they weren't strict Catholics, but they were the majority from where we lived anyway, outside. They would have been Catholics. There might have been an odd one, a Protestant, but as I said, you never knew. They never spoke much about it, and they, as I said, the likes of most of the German women wouldn't have gone to mass. My mother, I'd say, would have been one of the only ones that would have been fairly strict about going to mass, yeah, and keeping up the Catholic.
But they didn't find anything funny or peculiar about the Irish? Right?
No, they just thought that, at times we often laugh about it. See, the Germans were very, they were very strict about everything they did, and they were very, I mean, if you tried to cross the road before you should, they were very law-abiding, where it was quite the opposite, you know. I find this is what they loved about the Irish, that everybody was just so easygoing, and they enjoyed their drink, and they couldn't care less, you know, about anything. They were never, you know,
they won't be workaholics.
They wouldn't. No, that is one of the things that my father used to say. They're very lazy at times. You know, they need to be kind of, pushed along a little bit. But now it's completely different. I mean, people are far different now in their outlook. But in those days, people didn't have much, and if you had a job, you were lucky. There was a lot of people that were very, very badly off, and they didn't have anything at all. And I suppose when the glass factory started, it gave them a great interest, and kids then were automatically taken in. I mean, my brothers should have gone to work, but money was such a big thing, and they were earning such big money that the first thing they'd want to do is put them in and train them in and let them earn money. In those days, education wasn't such a priority, no. It was that they had more in life. They were able to go on holidays. They were able to do a lot of things that they wouldn't have been able to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I mean, the glass factory was the place.
Yes. Oh, there was so much jealousy. My God, there was terrible jealousy amongst all the different factories that people worked in, because definitely Waterford Crystal were the only factories where they would have got an awful lot of extra money, and all these extra perks that were done away with afterwards. I mean, that Noel Griffin would have got them, because they really worked hard, and he felt that they built up what they had so much that he felt that they should have a good wage, and he was very good to them.
And you were saying that they had free doctor?
Oh, they did, yeah. We had Dr. Kehoe was our free, and Mady Carr was the nurse. She used to work there, and if there was anything, she would look after us. And Bunny Keneally was the dentist. We had him, and as I said, it didn't matter. That was just a priority, you know, and that. But as I said, there's nothing more than, than that. Did you want to ask me anything else?
Nice. Could you say something in Bavarian for us now, Bavarian German?
What will I say? Ich bin von Bayern. Ich war geboren in Bayern, im Bayerischen Wald, und ich kann nur...
And your name? What's your name?
Mein Name, bevor ich geheiratet habe, war Ursula Gestel, und ich bin hier schon since 1950 und war in Deutschland geboren.
Okay, thanks a million.
Yeah, I hope that's... I mean, I wasn't expecting... I mean, this is just... Danke, bitteschön. Ich kann...
Do you speak some German?
Yeah. No, but
He's from the Czech
as I
Republic.
said, if I get together with people, all of a sudden, you know, when
It
you
comes
don't
out.
when you don't speak it for a long time, and then all of a sudden. But I mean, I could have a conversation now with somebody once I know they're Bavarian. I can. Do you know what? The people I can understand more than anybody is the Bavarian, the Austrian, because the Austrian language is more Bavarian than anybody. And I was at a play one night, and there was a thing about the Bavarians, and they had slang words, and I was laughing my head off because I can remember when I was a child, you know, all these words that were used, and there'd be things said that nobody else, even an ordinary German, wouldn't understand because that it was so, you know, ich möchte gerne das Spiegel tragen. It was like a little tin milk thing that you know, little words that you just couldn't, nobody else could understand, only somebody that was bred and born in Bavaria. You know, it's amazing. And that, but my grandfather would have come from the Czech. He would have been, my mother's name was Schielhavel. And ja, Schielhavel, Friede Schielhavel. Und das war, die waren in der Bäckerei in der Czech. Die haben gearbeitet da. Aber ich kann mir nur erinnern von, sagen wir, viele Sachen, wenn ich in Urlaub gegangen bin oder wenn ich welche Leute so getroffen habe und haben gesprochen von certain, you know, it's amazing the way things all come back, but it's very difficult.
Oh yeah.
And as I said, I need to have somebody in front of me. If somebody asks me something quick, I have to think about it before I can actually explain. But if I'm with somebody for any little, it starts to come back very slowly. But see, nobody's here anymore, and like when my parents were alive, or if I were going and coming more to, you know, we went over to the beer festival quite a few times, and you know, that was great because they were real.
Oktoberfest.
Das Oktoberfest. Ja. Und mein Mann hat mir ein Dirndl gekauft, aber ich hab's noch nicht angezogen hier. Ja, ich sage immer, wenn ich nach Bayern wiederkomme und am Bierfest, dann tue ich es mal andere anmachen. Ja.